Hello everybody, and welcome again to the Petersen Automotive Museum Deep Dive Series. Today we're going to be talking about our 1955 Mercury D528 concept car. Today we call them concept cars, but back in the 1950s they called them dream cars, because these were the vehicles that the Detroit designers were dreaming about. They were allowed to think very, very big. It was blue sky, anything was possible. World War II had ended a decade before, and we were coming to terms with all of the wonderful things that science was offering us, especially in the realm of the automobile. And automobile manufacturers found that if they built exotic cars, if they built dream cars, experimental cars, prototypes that they put out on display, that the public would be drawn to those, and by extension will add a bit of cachet to the regular production cars that were already in showrooms. I guess the thought was that they would look at this car and say, wow, if Mercury is thinking this far ahead, then just think what kinds of innovations must be embodied in the kind of Mercury that I can buy today. But if you were expecting to see this particular car on the show circuit, you would have been out of luck, because it's indeed a dream car, but it was one that, to our knowledge, was never shown to the general public. It was retained by Ford and used only for engineering purposes. And you really can't blame them for not putting this car out on the show circuit, because there's a lot that isn't perfect about this car. It really would not have shown off Mercury to its best to the general public. There are gap problems when the hood is down. There are issues, again, more gap issues. It's just not a perfect car. But what it was perfect for was for experimentation. For, again, the kind of blue sky thinking that the designers were encouraged to do back in the mid-1950s. And this car has a lot of innovations. Some of them you can't see, including what's under the hood, experimental wide block V8, the kind that you would have found in the Thunderbirds of the day, and a safety oriented chassis, and some other things having to do with suspension. But what is most evident about this car is its size and its lowness. This is the largest fiberglass car Ford ever built. Extremely low, because keep in mind, in the 1950s it was longer, lower, wider, and the lower you got, the longer your car seemed, even if it wasn't that long. Another thing that the engineers were experimenting with was a hardtop styling, a four-door hardtop. Now, when we talk about hardtop, we're not just talking about a rigid top structure that you cannot remove. We're talking about a vehicle that, when all the side windows are down, there's no B-pillar to obstruct your outward vision. So if I were to open all these doors, you would not see a B-pillar here. What looks like a B-pillar is another experimental feature, which is a roll bar. Wisely, I think the Ford engineers were thinking, if this car ever rolled over, because it's fiberglass, the occupants are in dire trouble. So why don't we innovate a roll bar and put it in? So if I were to open all of the doors, there's no window frame at the door opening, which again is a telltale sign of the hardtop styling. Again, no window frame at the door opening, no B-pillar per se, just the roll bar on the inside, which actually, if you look on the inside, it went under the headliner and around. But it was very nicely done, chrome-plated and whatnot. Another interesting thing about this car that it was born with, but that it does not have anymore, it did not have a cantilevered roof. In other words, it did not have any A-pillars to support it. The entire roof was supported with what they call the C-pillars back here. And it spread over the passenger compartment. And if you took this windshield out, it would literally be hanging there. But it wasn't very solid. So I think the Ford folks thought, well, let's save our pillarless cantilevered roof for another day, and let's add the B-pillars for a little bit of safety. And another thing that gives away the experimental, the concept nature of the car is how the window has aged over time, because this is plexiglass. It's not glass, and over time it has crazed. The Mercury D528 was Ford's first full-size car with a reverse sloping rear window. It was a feature that would not appear on the Ford lineup until 1958 on their Lincoln series, and ultimately showing up on Mercury's through the mid-60s. But this was the first time anybody ever saw this feature on a Ford. And the rear window could be made to go up and down electrically. Moving farther back, we talked about what was under the hood. We talked about the windshield, the C-pillars, the pillarless configuration. We talked about the roll bar. Now let's talk about the air conditioning system of this car. And the reason it has these two fin-like protrusions on the rear is because of the air conditioning. See, back in the mid-1950s, the air conditioning systems on cars were not as sophisticated as they are today, which meant that you had to have a very large evaporator, about half the size of a footlocker, that you had to accommodate, and you accommodated that in the trunk. Cars in the day would have the evaporator in the trunk, and there would be pipes that would come up to either the headliner or in the package shelf on the rear, and that's where the cooled air would come through. In this car, the idea was to put it in the back. The idea was to channel the cooled air through the C-pillars to a space between the headliner and the roof itself. And the headliner had perforations, small in the back, larger as you went to the front, so that the gently cooled air would just fall on the passengers without creating a breeze that would have made it maybe uncomfortable or would have caused a draft. Kind of an ingenious situation. You can tell that it really wasn't a long-term solution, judging by how many cars have it right now, which are none. But again, this is something you have to think about. It's something you have to try. And maybe this can give you another idea of a way to go. To accommodate the air conditioning system in the back, but still have room for luggage, what Ford designers did was they put the gas tank under the left fender, and they put the spare tire under the right fender. I guess this meant that you had to plan ahead with your collisions, because you would not want somebody to hit you on the left rear side of your car. But again, safety was a little bit in the back of everybody's mind. Right now they were experimenting with packaging of components, so we can kind of forgive them for that. But opening the trunk, it's cavernous inside. You could fit many, many suitcases. Well, when this car was done with the Ford designers, the Ford experimenters, the people that modified it in many ways over its lifetime in the Ford design and engineering studios, and it happened to be sitting in the Ford storage area alongside the 1955 Lincoln Futura, which was built in Italy by Ghia. It was a Lincoln concept car that was actually made it to the show circuit, and it was shown to the public, and was actually used in a movie called It Started With a Kiss, starring Glenn Ford, painted red for the movie. George Barris, very, very famous. What George Barris was able to do was talk Ford into giving him outright their obsolete concept cars so that they would have a second life in the movies. And just like the Lincoln Futura ended up becoming the Batmobile, this car ended up in at least one movie and a television series. Now, the movie that it was in was called The Patsy, and it was starring Jerry Lewis. And in the movie, it was called the Beldone. And the Mercury D528 script that was on the side was removed, and block letters Beldone were added to the bottom rocker panel right behind the front wheels. The car was painted red. It was given a black top. Each section of the grille was painted a different color just to give it that extra kick that Hollywood always seemed to enjoy. And George Barris, in addition to painting it, he outfitted it, rigged it so that the doors would pop open, the hood would pop open, the trunk would pop open. As a result, Jerry Lewis's character would be bewildered with what was going on. He was a patsy after all. He was the kind of the butt of the joke in the movie, and the car was a huge part of that film, and what made it today so interesting to automotive enthusiasts. Later in its life, it was used in a television series called The Outer Limits, and there were often times that Hollywood actually preferred to use obsolete concept cars and one-of-a-kinds and pilot production cars for their productions because they kind of give the actors a bit of cachet, a little bit uniqueness, even more so than they already had. Well, when this car was originally delivered to George Barris, it was delivered on the same rig that the Lincoln Futura that ultimately became the Batmobile was delivered. And as it happens, the Batmobile looks like it would have been painted the same copper color that the Mercury was in the time. Really, really fascinating that the Batmobile was elevated to such iconic status while the Mercury D528 kind of languished for a little while. But it didn't languish for long because it became the property of a series of collectors, one of whom painted it white and gave it a turquoise top, of course leaving the black and white interior pretty much alone. He later reversed that color combination, painted a turquoise, gave it a white top, again leaving the interior alone, and when it was restored, it was returned to its original copper body with the black top, and we believe that the interior is original. In fact, this car doesn't even have 300 miles on it. Again, it was used for Ford internal experimentation only to experiment with chassis features and other engineering upgrades for the time. Mr. Petersen acquired this car at an auction some years ago, and today it in the collection, serving as a reminder that not every concept car of every era made it to the show circuit. Sometimes the engineers just kept them, retained them for evaluation, and said, you know what, let's just hang on to that for another little while. We may want to revisit it. We may want to revisit that technology. And then when they decided that the time had come, Ford let it go to George Barris, and then it saw its time in the movies, it saw its time on television, and now it's here in the limelight of the Petersen Automotive Museum. Thank you again for joining me at the Petersen Automotive Museum. We'll see you next time.